The Trees, Conrad, Richter. Chapter 1. The Vision. They moved along in the bobbing, springy gait of a family that followed the woods as some families follow the sea. In the midday twilight of the forest, the father's shaggy gray figure looked hump-backed, but the hump was a pack. In that pack, under his rifle, were a froe and auger, bar, lead, and powder, blacksmith's traps, and a bag of Indian meal, wrapped up in a pair of yellow yarn blankets. Sayward carried the big kettle, and little kettle packed with small fixings. Jenny, the quilts thonged to her white shoulders, and Asha, a quarter of venison with the bloody folded buckskin her father had taken since the last trader. Even the littlest ones, Wyatt and Sully, had their burdens of axe, bullet mold, and clothes. Only their mother, Jerry Luckett, went light, for she was poorly with the slow fever, and could lug no more than the old blue Revolutionary greatcoat with the mended slit in the right shoulder. It was the game that had fetched the Lucketts out of Pennsylvania. Months before, the chestnut burrs had begun to sharpen. Worth Luckett looked for a woods famine. It would be like nothing since the second winter after Yorktown, he claimed. He spent so much time in the woods with nobody to talk to but Sarge, his old hound, that when he opened his mouth, Jerry had learned to pick up her ears and listen. For a month he had been noticing sign. The oaks, beeches, and hazel patches would have slim mast for bears and pigeons this year. Deer Pass lay barer than any time he could recollect of fresh droppings, and now the squirrels were leaving the country. He claimed he had stood on a log near the old Mingo hemlock and seen them pouring like a mill race through the woods. They ran as if a pack of black Seven Mountains wolves were on their tails, or worse, red piney squirrels tearing at the bucks to geld them. The very floor of the forest was gray and black with them. When they came to Paddy's Run, they didn't wait to take up and over the trees, but plunged in like beaver, and the live ones fought over the drowned ones' bodies. If meat on the go wasn't likely to be tainted, Worth could have caught himself a club and laid out 100 without the waste of a dram of powder. As it was, he just stood on his log like a duck in thunder, waiting to see if the old Harry himself was not on the tail end. And when the last came, there was nothing behind them, nothing he allowed but famine. The Luckett young ones stood listening to the tale with open mouths. The homespun over their hearts plopped in and out like the flanks of those runaway squirrels. They would have given the last stitch off their backs to have seen it. They wanted to go up west anyhow, and now they couldn't wait till tomorrow. but they daren't show it in front of their father. No, they just stood there, gaping and dying to hear what their mother would have to say. Jerry sat quiet on her homemade hickory rocker. Oh, she knew how bad Worth wanted an excuse to get away from here. Her eyes slanted down toward the clay floor, her mouth rounded a bit as if she took all these things, good, bad, and indifferent, and was running them quietly around inside her lips. Her mouth was so gentle and yet could shut like a mussel shell. She looked up, and there was no telling what lay in her mind. "You're aimin' to cross the Ohio?" she asked, and her eyes glinted a moment dangerously at her man. He gave a nod. Even her father, Sayward, saw. Didn't know what she'd say or do. He took out his clay pipe and made to fill it, but his eyes never stopped watching her face. The young ones could hardly stand the waiting now. Their mother went on grimly. "I told you I'd never go way back there." Hope died in their young faces. She dropped her eyes and stared a long time across the door-sill, then around the cabin room at the familiar slab stools and puncheon table, the hand-whittled loom and wheel, and across the door-sill again to the mite of a grave in the clearing. None of these things could they take along. After a while she stared up half-ways at them, and yet back in her mouth she complained, "What's a body to do if the game's left the country?" The four younger ones turned and made stiff and pious passage from the cabin. Once out in the twilight, they threw themselves on the ground, rolling and somersetting, leaping and kicking their bare feet, whooping and giving vent to their feelings, like a pack of young coon dogs let out of the pen for a night's hunt. Sayward, the oldest, went back to the haunch over the fire, turning it on the hook, catching some of the drippings in a long whittled spoon, and basting it with its own juices. She hadn't given away to her feelings since her small hands had guided her youngest brother into the world. He was the fairest babe any of them had ever laid eyes on, and she had slapped his little body, naked as a wild squab, till her hand was lame, but never would he open his mouth to cry or his lids to clap sight on his brother and sisters waiting to lug him around. She had been just a little tyke then. Now she was 15, and most a grown woman with the fire playing on her bare legs and short gown. It took no trying to carry her breast and head up. Life flowed through her calm and strong as current down the river. She could throw the other young ones 4 at a time and hold them squirming to the ground. Not so all fired hard. They would yell at her when she'd comb or scrub them. Once, when Worth was off to the Black Forest for pine martens, and they hadn't a sliver of meat or dust of meal in the cabin, she had seen a young white-faced buck swimming the river, and had run bare-handed into the deep water, grabbed hold of his spikes, and tried to drown him like the black hunter of the Junwata. For a while there they had, splashing aplenty, while the other young ones and Jerry ran helpless up and down the bank. But when Worth came home with a few skins and nothing more than a skinny possum for meat, he found 3/4 of venison hanging up and a small, fresh deer hide pegged to one of the trees. Now they had crossed the Ohio on a pole ferry, and the mud on their feet was no longer the familiar red and brown earth of Pennsylvania. It was black like dung. The young ones were wild over tramping the same trace their father had tramped as a boy with Colonel Boquet. Here was where the army sheep had to be shut in for the night, and here where the soldiers had axed the trace wider to let the army train through. It was a country of hills, and Jerry had said she could breathe again, like on those mortal sweet hills of Pennsylvania. Now that those hills were so far behind her, it was easier to give them up. Perhaps it wouldn't be so bad out here like she thought. What was the use of living in the same state as your folks if you never saw them anyhow? They rounded a high ridge. A devil's racecourse cleared the air of limbs below. Here was something Worth had not told them about. For a moment Sayward reckoned that her father had fetched them unbeknownst to the western ocean, and what lay beneath was the late sun glittering on green-black water. Then she saw that what they looked down on was a dark, illimitable expanse of wilderness. It was a sea of solid tree-tops, broken only by some gash where deep beneath the foliage an unknown stream made its way. As far as the eye could reach, this lonely forest sea rolled on and on, till its faint blue billows broke against an incredibly distant horizon. They had all stopped with a common notion, and stood looking out. Sayward saw her mother's eyes search with the hope of finding some settlement, or leastwise a settler's clearing, but over that vasty solitude no wisp of smoke arose. Though they waited here till night, the girl knew that no light of human habitation would appear except the solitary red spark of some Delaware or Shawnee campfire. Already the lowering sun slanted melancholy rays over the scene, and as it sank, the shadows of those far hills reached out with long fingers. It was a picture Sayward was to carry to her grave, although she didn't know it then, in later years when it was all to go so that her own father wouldn't know the place if he rose from his berry hole. She was to call the scene to mind. This is the way it was, she would say to herself. Nowhere else but in the American wilderness could it have been. The sun was gone now. Far out they heard the yelping of a wolf, and nearer the caterwauling of a panther. Worth stood leaning on his long Lancaster rifle, his nose wrinkling like a hound's. "You can smell the game," he said hungrily. Sayward sniffed. All she could wend was the scent of wild herbs and leaves mingled with the faint, strange fetor of rancor, blacker earth than she knew in Pennsylvania. She looked at her brother and sisters. They stood with young eyes drinking in this place, and it was plain as if drawn on shell bark that what they saw were otters coasting down muddy slides and gray moose crashing through the woods, and fat beaver cracking down their broad tails on Gat water like pistol shots. They could see skins drying on the log walls of a cabin yet unbuilt, and skins in a heavy pack on their father's shoulders, and skins handed over the counter of a trader's post, along the Sciato or Ohio, where the shelves hung heavy with black and white English blankets, turkey red calico, bolts of Merrimack blue, shawls with fringes, brass-bound muskets, and buckets of white beads. "We mought even get rich and have shoes," Sully spoke out. That broke the tension. They all looked down on her and smiled. Little Ursula, the baby of the family, the one they gave in to the most. One time she could look at you with such a helpless mouth, and then when you least expected it, she was spunky as a young coon, and said grand things that no one dared think of but she and her grandmom, Powley, who had a story and a half-chip log house across the road from Grandpap's gunsmith shop along the Conestoga. Chapter 2. The Dark Country. It seemed strange the next few days when Sayward recollected the vision and realized that now they were down under that ocean of leaves. A red-tailed hawk screeching high over the tree tops would hardly reckon there was a road down here. You had to be a porcupine rooting under the branches to find it, or the black cat of the forest that could see in the dark, and that some called the Fisher Fox. This place, Jerry quavered to Sayward, must be the grand-daddy of all the forest. Here the trees had been old men with beards when the woods in Pennsylvania were still whips. Sayward watched her mother puttering along between the great shaggy butts that dripped with moss and moisture. All day she could see Jerry's sunken eyes keep watching dully ahead for some sign that they might be coming out under a bit of sky. Down in Pennsylvania, you could tell by the light when a faint white drifted through the dark forest wall ahead. You knew you were getting to the top of a hill or an open place. You might come out in a meadow or clearing, perhaps even in an open field, with the corn making tassels and smelling sweet in the sun. But away back here across the Ohio, it had no fields. You tramped day long, and when you looked ahead, the woods were dark as an hour or a day ago. Sayward could feel the woods most when the time came to step a few feet into the brush. Sometimes Sully or Jenny ran in after her. Sometimes she went alone. The family bobbed on in a single file, and in a lick or two the forest had swallowed them up. While she waited here with the green leaves brushing her skin, with the monster brown trunks close enough to touch, and all around her those wild, unkempt graves of ancient windfalls, she minded what her father had once told her. He had been tramping with his gun in the Black Forest when he felt it. He was a grown man, and had followed the woods since he was a boy, and yet something came over him in those dark pines and hemlocks, where the sun never came so that he wanted to run. He had hardly seen even a piney squirrel all day, and he saw nothing afterwards. "I was so afraid. I broke out in a sweat," he said. 2 hunters from the West Branch told him they knew what he meant. What made it, they didn't know. It came over them, no place but the deep woods. When pressed, Worth reckoned it might be a panther following his scent, for panthers were curious about humans. A while back he had circled in a tracking snow, and found where one of the long yellow beasts had been snuffing behind him on his trail. But Sayward had the feeling her father hadn't said what lay deepest in his mind. Alone here in these woods, sometimes she could feel it. The trace was gone, as if it had never been. The only roads were the deer pass. They looked like humans had made them. They coaxed you to come on. They'd lead you to a clearing, they said. They'd take you clear out of the woods. But well she knew that once she followed, they would twist and turn and circle on themselves and peter out in the middle of some swamp. Nothing moved in here. Even the green daylight stood still. The moss was thick and soft as a pallet. It invited you to lay down, and yet Sayward's feet wanted to run. "It's nothin' but the woods fever," she would tell herself, and make that self stand there and count clock time before she let her legs go. She stood up so stout, the skirt of her short gown flared out a little in front. Between strong cheekbones her eyes looked at you blue and straight as whortleberries, and her hair hung in yellow braids, heavy as hawsers on a Monongahela keel boat. It was good to get back to the Indian trace. After that, human feet had packed it, and like human feet it was never still, turning and dodging to miss the butts of the big trees. It pleased her to catch up to the family and hear the young ones crowing and quarreling over the droppings of some fox, wolf, coon, or fisher fox in the trace, or to see her father point where a beast had stood on its hind legs and sharpened its claws in long scratches on the bark of a tree. Some of the young ones would guess painter and some link, meaning the black-browed catamount with hair on the balls of its feet. "I reckon it was no more 'n a bobcat," Jerry would say, soothingly, for she liked to think there was no savage beast in these woods as big as Sully. "It was a big black bear," little Sully herself would call out, and look quickly behind her. Nothing could ever come big enough for Sully, though it might come too close. Generally Worth would wait to tell them what it was until the pack had come down off his shoulders. Camp and household chores blew out of his mind like down out of a thistle, but he never forgot a lick that had to do with the woods. When his tongue was supple, he could sit on a log by the campfire and go back over the day's tramp, naming every sign and the beast that had made it, together with the trees that stood by. Most times he even said whether it was made by a he or a she one. Once they came to a fork in the trace, where a child's skull hung on a pole, and the beech trees were carved with sign. "Can you read it?" little Wyatt asked, standing there with his fur cap askew, high on the shock of his sandy hair. "Oh, I can read it all right," his father said, evasively. He went from tree to tree, standing in front of each, and rubbing his beard. He told them the left-hand fork kept to the woods, and the right-hand one, if he minded right, led to Sandusky and the English seas. Sayward saw a faint light break on her mother's face. Here, in this shadowy, shut-in place, "I heard," she said, "it's fine livin' in the open prairie by the English seas." "It's too fur for you, Jerry," Worth told her. "I'm stout," she said, straightening. "I can walk a long ways. The game's cleaned out up there. You mought get wild bulls in the open prairies," she told him. But Worth didn't hold much to that. How could he swap talk with any of the foreign Indians? Up there. Now Delaware was second nature to him, for wasn't he part Delaware himself, and Shawnee he could get along with. In the end they took the left-hand fork, and the light faded from Jerry's face. All that day and the next the forest continued to thicken. None but Worth had ever laid eyes on such trees. A black walnut stood along the trace, and 3 of them couldn't reach around it. No, they had to get a 4th to span it. Still bigger buttonwoods stood rooted on a creek's bank. Worth reckoned the heaviest close to 15 feet through. He bragged he could drive 2 yoke of oxen past each other and never get off that stump. Jerry's face had gone cruelly bleak at the talk of oxen in this wild place. She peered dully at the nameless stream. The giant trees reached over and covered it from either side. Even in the middle, the water looked dark as old Virginia tobacco. "Ain't it got sun in these woods, Worth?" she complained, her eyes hard on him like her enemy. And when he had shed his pack and gone nosing downstream with his gun and Sarge, "If anything happens me, Saird, don't let him always have his way. You'll never get the chance to see Pennsylvania again." "I mought never want to go back," Sayward encouraged her. "Don't talk about the old state that-a-way." Jerry sat the log, her face slanted down, her head giving at every beat of the blood in her gaunt neck. "I knowed it that day on the ferry. I made all your beds wrong for you. Now you'll have to sleep in 'em as best you can." A long time afterward they heard Worth fairly hallooing down the stream. "What can he see and hear?" Jerry muttered. "He mought have found some rifles we can cross without gettin' wet to our middles," Sayward said. Together she and Asha managed their father's heavy pack between them. When they reached him far off the trace, the stream was still deep and slow with flecks of brown foam. "Hain't you got eyes in your heads?" Worth put at them, puffing on his clay, his own eyes sharp and knowing in his beard. Sayward expected at first the black soil where he stood was scattered with small gray stone. Then she saw they were the shed horns of deer, Most of them were broken up. Porcupines, squirrels, and other woods creatures had eaten them through, and yet so many pieces lay around that at one place they made a thin drift, like the gray leavings of last year's snow. It was plain even to little Sully's wide eyes that herds of deer had been coming here for many winters to shed. Most every tree you looked at was rubbed smooth in places as their old axe handle. Worth said little, but the smoke came fast from his bearded lips. He showed them what he called a shovel horn, and a blue horn, and one on which he counted 13 points. In the crotch of a tree where some Indian must have hung them, he fetched out 2 unbroken, gray moose horns. When he set them on the ground and put their tips together, all the young ones, save Sayward, could walk under. By the tarnal, he kept saying. He took them where the dark stream emptied in a log-choked river. Down the river path he fetched them to a small run, and up that run to a strong spring cradled in the knees of an old beech. The ground hereabouts was black as charcoal, and the timber the densest stand Sayward had yet seen. God Almighty, she expected, would have to take an axe here if he wanted to look up and see the firmament. He made. The big butts stood shoulder to shoulder, and something came in Jerry's sunken eyes, as if she had found herself in a herd of those great foreign elephant beasts she had told her young ones 100 times she had once seen splashing through the mud of a Lancaster Street fair. She looked around her in a sort of terror. "You don't aim to stay here, Worth. Where'd you get sticks for a cabin? It'd take you all winter a-maulin' those big butts." "Oh, it's got light timber here and yonder," Worth said. He looked up tolerantly at the wild grape and other creepers roping tree to tree with sloping leafy thatches that shut out every wandering speck of God's free air. Jerry opened her mouth, no more except to swoop in what breath she could in this choked-up place. She had had her say, and what good did it do her? The time to have set herself against this place was away back in the old state when Worth claimed the squirrels were leaving the country. Now she and her young ones were here, and here likely they would stay. The sun must have been straight overhead, for at one place a shaft of light filtered through. It was pale and thin, but it looked golden as a guinea. For 100 feet it fell straight to the ground. Woods flies were rising and falling in it. Jerry watched them. When they dropped, they seemed to be falling down some deep dark well, and she and her young ones, she told herself, were on the bottom. Chapter 3. Ridgepole. The young ones hailed the end of their journey like the start of a frolic. They threw off the packs they never need carry again, and swarmed over the ground like young foxes or wolves at play, racing and tagging and yelping at each other. Jenny was the swiftest. None of them could catch her. She'd tear around with her thin white legs, her torn short gown and hair flying behind her, but Asha could keep going when the others played out. Long after you couldn't see them anymore, their shrill cries came like bird calls from the forest. Wyatt hid in a hollow log, and it was a good while till they found him, though now and then you could hear a muffled bark like it came from the ground. Little Sully climbed a young tree, holding on to the ropey creepers. "I'm up higher in a chimney," she yelled. "I'm up so high I can't even see you." Worth's square axe rang in the woods, and small trees here and there began raising dust and twigs as they came toppling down. After the first few fell, Sayward saw her mother piddle over to peer up where they had stood, as if they must have left a hole where she could see the sky. But the high roof of leaves stayed unbroken. When he had the notion Worth could be a handy man with tools, and now the white chips spun from sunup to early forest dark. He wanted to finish this stint of a cabin and get at the more important chore of game. He hadn't even time to answer the questions of his favorite young one. Every so often during the day, Sully would come trotting over and stand by him until he stopped to wipe his forehead of sweat. "Pappy," she would begin. "Wha," he would encourage her in the patient tone that always came out of his beard when he spoke to her. As she started to talk, he would nod understandingly and sympathetically and go on chopping softly at first, then more strongly, until the sound of the axe would gradually drown out the small, earnest voice, and off she would trot, halfways satisfied till the next time. Oh, you would think Worth was the hard-working home-body to see him, but once he winded, a fox or the young ones came running in with news of a fresh bear track. Before Saywood could stop them, he would change right in front of your eyes. A sharp look would come in his eyes. He couldn't wait now till he got this out of his system. The axe handle slipped from his hand, and the powder horn over his head, and likely they wouldn't see him again till the shadows were so mighty thick you couldn't tell if that thing coming through the big butts was a white man or an Indian. Most always he had on his back a skin or two wrapped around the choicest parts of the carcass. The first time he had gone off without saying anything, and left the cabin stand all day. Sayward expected her mother to sull and lay for him when he got back, but Jerry took no more interest in the cabin than a squirrel hole in a tree. She went about like she didn't know it was standing there, logged up no higher than Sully's head, with its top open to every gust of rain and wind and flying jaybird. This crib of saddled logs under these dark trees was no place she would ever live in. Daytimes she dallied around the cooking kettles, and evenings she lay in their little half-faced lean-to with the deep hollows of her eyes closed. She said she couldn't look at the young ones around the night fire. Here, under the big butts, they looked like little people. The black arcs were mighty far overhead. Even when you threw bark on the fire, its light was swallowed up before it went a dozen poles down these dark forest aisles that ran on and on, only God knew how many miles to the English seas and the New Orleans River. Now that the hunting was good, Worth ran balls at night and wandered with his rifle all day. Pegged skins multiplied on the trees. The cabin had blown out of his mind, light as a green gabby bird feather. "You can smell the fall," Sayward one day reminded her mother. "I don't keep track of the days no more," Jerry said. "It's a-gettin' late," Sayward went on. "Just goin' to the spring. You can see a long ways under the trees." "I ain't noticed," Jerry complained. "My eyes can't see so good in here." "It'll give ice on the river one of these fine mornin's." "Like as not," Jerry sighed. "That's the way it runs." Sayward went about her business. If her mother and father didn't care how soon the snow flew, and them living in a half-faced lean-to, it was nothing to her. The gums along the river flew their colored rags. Sassafras mittens hung a kind of red-yellow, and dogwoods flushed up like the wattles of wild turkey gobblers. Of a morning, the pinch of frost nipped your legs, and acorns in the deer paths were mighty hard on bare feet. The woods air smelled fermented as cider, and the hill hooters of a night tried to raise the dead. Not that the young ones minded. They were drunk on fall. It was hardly daylight till they piled out of the lean-to hunt chestnuts and drag in shellbarks, and look first at their snares for small game. Piles of walnut holes rose by the big rock, and their hands were stained darker than Shawanese. They hung to scarlet creepers and swung back and forward over logs that would have broken their backs had they ever let go. At deep dusk, when they came in, they ate, yawned, and lay down together in the shelter like a pile of wolf puppies for warmth, till it was time to be up and rip and tear again. When they wanted anything, they came to Sayward, now rather than their mother. It took too long to get their meaning over to this slow woman sucked of her blood, who lay abed or dallied around like a croon, though she was still in her 30s. No, they were too full of go for the likes of her. It meant small shakes to them that the cabin wasn't done. They were tickled the leaves were coming down. They ran through them like it was the first snowfall, kicking them with their bare feet to stir up that tanyard smell. The gum leaves were about the first to drop. The maples, ash, and poplars shed not long after. You couldn't open your eyes without seeing the air full of leaves. They had no mind where they wanted to land. Some turned head over tin cup till it made a body dizzy to watch. All night long you could hear them whisper when they lit. By morning the sleepers in the shelter were stitched with a hap of red, brown, and gold. Sully spread her fingers like a fork, and scratched herself a great pile to burrow in. "I'm a white-footed mouse," she yelled, sticking her head through, "and I'm not a-comin' out till I come with young'uns a-hangin' to my dugs." "You're a young'un yourself, still a-hangin' to your mam's dugs." Asha mocked at her, jumping over and kicking at her pile of leaves. Don't you tetch my house, or I'll get a club and knock your noggin off," Wyatt threatened. Jenny ran after Asha and yanked her by the hair, so she swore like a man, "Can't catch a terrapin, can't catch a terrapin." She dared her and sailed off with Asha hard after. It was all over. Sayward knew the morning it started to rain. Rain afore breakfast. Quit afore noon, Jenny said. But Sayward reckoned they had a mortal late breakfast this morning. The cabin looked forlorn, standing there roofless, and only half raised in the rain, and darkest day they had seen as yet in these parts. It put Sayward in mind of the deserted places Worth used to tell he saw in the Pennsylvania woods. Jerry had always felt for those poor people, wondering had they died of a fever, or was their hair lifted by the Mingos. And yet their own lonesome cabin Jerry did not care a hoot about. No, she wouldn't even look at it. Not a word would she say to get Worth at roofing it. That night the rain kept on and the wind came up. Now the wind held its breath, and now it tried to fetch down the trees. The logs in the half-raised cabin creaked and groaned. A cold, wet Sarge came in among them deep as he could squirm to shut out the hullabaloo from his thin-skinned hound ears. All night the wind rose. Now it came and now it went. This was a lull. You could hear the trees dripping. Then far off you could catch the next wave coming for you through the woods. You knew that all the coons in their nests were lying there, listening and waiting for it like you. And when it came, you could feel the tall butts bending over you like fish poles. Limbs cracked off like rifle shots. The wind, Sayward thought, dragged a long splint broom. First it passed over the tops of the trees, thrashing the branches. After a while, the splints reached down on the ground, rattling the leaves, twigs, and sticks, and sweeping them in the lean-to. The wind and rain let up about dawn. None of the Luckets had more than catnapped all night. Now they lay back in the quiet after the storm and slept. Sayward dreamed she saw her mother standing outside. "God help me," Jerry said. When the girl opened her eyes, a bright light shone in her face. She sat up and saw her mother standing where she had seen her in her dream, her tousled hair down her rounded back. Then the girl saw that last night's storm had stripped the leaves from half the trees. Her mother looked like a half-blinded human that had lived all summer in a cave. She stood there peering up through the bare branches of an ash at the sky, so blue it hurt just to look at it. "I never thought I'd live to see this day," she muttered to Sayward. For the first time in days, she had the girl comb out her matted hair, all the time warming herself in the sun, her wrinkled face held up to light and sky. Then she washed herself a little at the run, when Worth got up and fetched out his rifle from under the pressed leaves to see if it was dry. She was sitting on a wet log, and her mouth, that could be so gentle, was hard like a mussel shell. "You started a cabin, or ain't ya, Worth?" She came out at him, her eyes cruel as death. "Or maybe you take us for woodchucks. with a hole in the ground. It was good to hear the old Jerry. Worth flushed up through his beard. No more of the cabin was said between them. Worth ran a tallowed rag through his rifle and laid it carefully away. All day his axe hacked and slashed, hewed and chipped in the woods. It grew dark early this time of year. Sayward kept fires going for light. She and Asha helped him lift the logs into place, locking saddle to notch and notch to saddle. After them came the rafters. The days now were gray and cold. Sayward wedged in poles for chinking. The young ones carried white clay from the river bank for Jenny to daub it. Jerry helped. Worth was laying the rib poles now, turning the bows to the sky, for the weight of the roof would settle them straight. Soon as he got done at one end, the young ones scuttled up like piney squirrels, thatching it with shell bark. That, with the help of hides, had to do till the black ash bark would run in the spring. If it turned out that they would stay, he would split out clapboards. Long top rib poles held the bark and hides down. They jutted out from the roof like steer horns, lashed to the under rib poles with leatherwood and hickory withes. "You better move in the shanty tonight," Worth said late afternoon. All day a gray light like frost mist had hung and driven through the black butts and branch work of the woods. Oh, this was winter now. Anybody with half an eye could tell. As long as daylight lasted, the young ones fetched in fresh leaves from where the wind had raked them in windows behind some bush or stump. Chips and log leavings they piled in the chimney corner. The chimney wasn't topped off yet with sticks and clay, but it drew fire. It still seemed the middle of the afternoon when dusk moved over the forest and settled down. "It's snowin'," Asha called out when she came back in that evening. "Snowin'," Jerry quavered pleasantly. Sayward watched her mother's eyes take a turn around the cabin. The firelight played sociable fingers on roof and rafters. The logs smelled clean, and the beds of new leaves made you sleepy. Everything was spick and fine as a newborn babe in a fresh log cradle. Piles of knobby hickory nuts and black and white walnuts lay holed in a corner. Tomorrow or the next day, Worth would take his old frau and split chinking boards for loft and shelves and puncheons for a trencher. Already he had an old wind-blown poplar log picked out. The girl felt her mother's loving eyes rest on each one of them. All except that little brother back in Pennsylvania were here together. They had a roof over their heads and a bag of meal hanging from the rafters. A buckskin door, weighted with a short green log, shut out the dark and snow. Her mother's eyes were mortal young and warm tonight in their deep sockets, so they must have looked, Sayward reckoned, when she had moved in their first cabin along the Junita. 3 of her young ones were to get born in the world there. Chapter 4. The Square Axe. Once they were in the cabin, they had creature comforts again. Worth set his gun up in a dark corner where he wouldn't see it unless he had to, and set to work splitting out 3-inch puncheons and hewing them smooth with the axe. With these he made a trencher to eat off of, a bench to sit down on, and a door with hickory hinges to keep out forest beasts. The bench wouldn't set even on the rolling dirt floor, and he bedded it in the tamped earth, but his stools were fine and steady any place you put them, for they had only 3 legs. Stillworth wouldn't say he had enough. No such thing. He'd work till he was black in the face, splitting out clapboards and laying them on the scout joist for a loft. Before he was done, they all had to climb the ladder and see how snug and warm a place he'd made under the eaves, where you could lay of a night and listen to the rain on the roof over your head. 3 of the young ones fought to have their beds up there, with the woods mice racing over their legs in the dark, and the chipmunks rolling walnuts and hickory nuts over the loft floor soon as it began to come daylight. And Stillworth wouldn't stop, not till he had worked out his mind. He had to make a last splurge. This would be a mortal handy thing for a house, something you had to pay tax on if you had one down in Pennsylvania. He steadied the logs with wedges, marked them with a straight edge, and chopped out a hole, dressing it smooth with axe and knife. Over the hole he plastered a few cross sticks, and fast to the sticks the marriage paper the Conestoga dominie had given them. Worth had always plagued Jerry for lugging such a useless thing around with her, but now that he greased it with bear's oil, he reckoned it might be of some account. It let the sun through like glass. Oh, then it was a sight to see in that dark cabin, a window light blazing up like it was a fire, and making all the cubby holes and corners plain as outside till you could see the marks the bark worms left on the logs. Even Jerry said it was a tolerable place to live. They had to blister their feet a long ways to get here, but now they were holed up snug and cozy as a bear in his hollow tree. Let the winter cut up his didoes. Let the king's men come down from the English lakes, if they had a mind to. They'd have a hard time finding the Luckets in this shut-in place. The woods were wide and deep. The cabin stood hid in the trees, like a pigeon in a haystack. But after some Indian hunters had foxed them out, Jerry complained. What was the use of putting up a cabin fine as a fiddle if you let such kind make it a public house? Down in Pennsylvania, the whites were thick as dogberries, and the few Indians left knew their place. Away back here the whites were scarce as birds' teeth, and the Indians plenty as dogberries. Their sharp eyes picked up worse spent bullet patches and tracked him to his cabin, where they drifted in with no more knocking than leaves in October. Their fussels they set in the chimney corner for the priming to dry, and themselves on the floor under the bag of Indian meal swinging from a joist. "Woo stink!" little Sully cried, holding her nose with her fingers. Worth gave her a clip over the head and told Sayward to make them some Johnny cake. The warm smell of baking meal in the cabin soon thawed out their tongues. They swapped grave talk with Worth, and felt polite hands over the window and the skins he showed them, blowing the fur expertly apart at the places it was thickest and finest, but Jerry eyed the emptying grain bag with ropey mouth and angry, rebellious eyes. Never had she been the one to take up with the red people. No Worth was as much Indian as anybody she wanted to know. All the Delawares, Shawnees, Ottawas, and the Six Nations of the Mingos she ever saw were different from her people as a night dog from a hound. Oh, whites weren't sinless, especially in the woods. Some went around, bad as Indians, holding a grudge, but they couldn't hold a candle to their red brothers when it came to paying it. If Indians couldn't get back at the white persons that harmed them, they'd take it out on some handy white women or poor young ones they happened to meet up with that had nothing to do with it. They'd hack off their scalps, likely with some brains hanging to them, and set their pitiful hair up on a pole and prance around poking firebrands at it and bragging and carrying on like they had licked General Wayne and his whole army. No, Jerry had little love for Indians in general, and these digging in her meal bag in particular. If the Shawnees raised corn, like Worth said, why didn't they stay at home and eat their own? It rankled her to have to sit by helpless and see them coming this way as long as her meal lasted, and eating what was meant for her young ones. And when Worth told Sayward to shake the bag for the last dust of meal to feed some that had been feasting on her plenty before, Jerry flared up. She took that meal bag and sat on it, her mouth tight. Her eyes dared them all to come and get it, and Worth too, if he reckoned he could. Those red hunters from Shawnee Town didn't stay long after that. There you go, a-makin' bad friends, Worth told her when they had left. They'd feed me when I go to their place. You got no business a-goin' to their place. Jerry's eyes flashed at him. You got a family to come on home to. They mought not be good enough for you, Worth said, but they are for me. The only sign that Jerry heard him was her sewed-up mouth. He began to get mad as she. If the Injun has any ornery tricks, who do you expect he learned them from but the whites? That was too much for Jerry. Bosh and moonshine, she flared out at him. Injuns was a scalpin' and a massacrin' and torturin' and burnin' up their own brothers long before they ever heard of a white person. They brag their own selves how they killed off all the Injuns that used to live round here. Did you ever hear of an Injun payin' even a fi'penny bit for land like the whites? Worth would say nothing more. There was no use trying to get the best of Jerry. You might as well try to head off a gad or talk back to a wop. His eyes retreated ominously into his beard till you couldn't see much more than the whites. In the morning he took his gun and Sarge and did not come back that night. Next day it started a cold rain. On toward dusk they thought they heard Worth coming, and Sully ran to open the door. A Delaware stood there with the firelight licking on his wet face and on the silver wheels in his ears that were stretched down halfways to his shoulders. He was ugly as sin, bedraggled in his match coat as a wet turkey hen, but in he tramped, big as some redcoat major. The water ran off him in little streams, and when he got to the fire, he shook himself like a dog. The drops rained all over. He sat himself down by the warm hearth to dry. You might have reckoned this was his own cabin, and his squaw and young ones could be mortal glad to see him home again. Jerry had stared after him with a tight-mouthed, angry look. Now she turned to Sayward. If I had my way, her eyes said, I'd seed him in the river first. But what's a body to do? Turn him out in the rain? Sayward was sitting by the trencher when he came. Now she went on about her business, working a doeskin with her hands. They had taken the hair off with lye from fire ashes and tanned it with oak bark liquor in a log trough. Once the hide was worked soft, Jerry would lay it on the trencher and cut it out with the cabin knife, and Jenny's nimble fingers would sew up a shirt for Wyatt. He had some squirrel ready that he wanted it trimmed with. Every morning he made the rounds of his log and sapling snares, hoping for a mink or otter skin. Worth could trade for buttons when he went to some post. With black fur trimmings and horn or pewter buttons, Wyatt was going to be a dandy and no mistake. When their collar got too hot in front, he turned his side to the fire, and Sayward had a good look at him. She had never seen this one before. His nose was big as a red Conestoga potato. It even had eyes like a potato. Put that nose in a dark place like a cellar, and it looked like it would grow white sprouts. But nobody could sit bigger at the hearth. Sayward had nothing for the way squaws gave in to their men, waiting on them hand and foot, giving them the notion they were lords of creation. About all these men would turn a finger to was war and hunt. Let them kill themselves a fat deer. Would they fetch it in? Not them. They'd hang it up on the nearest tree, where the wolves couldn't get it, and march back to camp with nothing but their fussels over their shoulders. No, their squaws could come out and skin it and fetch it in. For all she knew, this one here had plenty meat hanging out in the woods right now. It looked like it, for mighty little of theirs did he eat that evening, though she had roasted it to a turn. Worth hadn't come home, and he wasn't likely to any more tonight, for when Sayward went out, the rain on the door log had turned to ice. It was a black world, but tomorrow, she reckoned, would be a white one, and then they would have a new job getting rid of their company, for if there was one thing an Indian hated worse than getting out in the rain, it was getting out in the snow. You can sleep up in the loft tonight, Sayward told Jenny. I'll lay with ma'am. Jenny had plenty to say to that. She wouldn't have a savage, who never washed from one summer to the next, sleeping on her and Sayward's bed. But Sayward shooed her up the ladder, and that was an end to it. When the Delaware was out, she pushed the axe under the leaves where she and Jerry would lie. She piled logs on the fire to give light till morning. Then, when he came in, she barred the door, and lay down beside her mother in her short gown. If this fellow had any red cronies hanging around outside, he would have to get up to let them in. Overhead in the loft, she could hear the young ones restless and wakeful, but Jerry could doze off the minute her head touched the bed leaves. She lay there on her back with her mouth open. Her quiet snoring served to quiet those in the loft. Little by little their whisperings and turnings played out. After a while the clapboards overhead lay silent for all the firelight that ran back and forward across them. Now Sayward told herself there were only 2 left awake in the cabin. Oh, that red body on the hearth could lie there still as it pleased him. He could suck his breath in and out like he was dead to the world, but he couldn't pull wool over her eyes. She was shy of believing that a woods Indian would drop off to sleep like a baby in a white man's house. The wind was coming up, driving sleet and hard snow like fine bullets against the cabin, hunting for holes, but it couldn't get in. Sayward lay there thinking of all the folks she had heard about who had taken in strangers on some cold or rainy night when they shouldn't. From the loft she could hear the young ones' soft breathing. In her mind she could see them lying close together with their arms around each other. Asha or Jenny would be on the outside. That one would be the first a tomahawk would reach from the ladder. Once or twice she caught herself breathing heavy and mighty near sleep. After a long while a shadow told her that their company was moving. She lay still as a log, save for her breath, watching through her merely shut lashes. He was raising up like a possum that had played dead. Now he looked over at the bed with sharp black eyes. He took his knife out of his belt, and Sayward's hand found the axe helve under the leaves, sweating around it. When she was a little tight, Sayward recollected Jerry would tell her not to fret if an Indian came around the cabin. No, she could shut her eyes and go to sleep. Like as not, the black hunter of the Janita was outside in the bushes, watching over them like he watched over all mothers and young ones, and his ball never missed. But across the Ohio it had no black hunter. She would have to do this her own self. Should he climb for the young ones first, never would he know what struck him. But if he came first for her and Jerry's bed, then she would rise up and cleave him straight between the eyes, like the woman back on Dunkard's Creek in Pennsylvania. Oh, she wasn't as big as Experience Bogarth, who had hacked out the brains of one red devil and the insides of another, and cleaved the head of the third, who tried to push himself in the door when she would shut it. But if a lone woman could do that much, she could drive her axe in one shaved head, so it would take Worth to pull it out when he came home. She flexed her muscles, ready to raise up, and that's the last she had to till morning. Now, who would have thought this Delaware didn't like her roast? That big, heavy body had pulled a hunk of meat, black with dried blood, from his hunting shirt, and was cutting it in two on the hearth. Now he sat there big as you please, roasting a piece to suit himself, on a long sharp stick of kindling. from the chimney corner. Oh, you could see he could hardly wait to gobble it down. He ate with the blood running down his chin, smacking his lips and licking his fingers. Then he lay down belching like one who had to wait a long time for a supper he liked. But now he was well fed, and these white squaws with their burned cooking weren't any wiser. Sayward wouldn't have felt surprised to find the door open and him gone next morning, but the snow was still coming down, and that held him. Worth tracked in soon after with 2 deer hides and a fine black fisher fox. He scowled a little to see the Indians sitting there on the floor. They talked a while in Delaware till Jerry ran out of firewood. "I told you many a time," Worth growled, "not to leave your axe out under the snow." Sayward took it from the bed of leaves, while her father eyed her close. "You sleep here with Jerry last night?" She nodded. The Delaware was watching too. His sharp black eyes ran from face to face for what he could read. He picked up the axe and ran his finger over a bit, and you could see he was putting 2 and 2 together. Oh, you could see this was a joke to him. A young squaw taking an axe to bed against a stout, hearty hunter like he was. He laughed silently, his nose and belly both shaking like bone jelly. He gave her back the axe, and felt the girl's arm and thigh. "He don't know no better," Worth said. The Delaware was like a big child now. He had to go over this joke till it was stale, but Worth didn't laugh. "I don't want you takin' no more Injuns in when I'm off," he said darkly after the company was gone. "I thought you liked Injuns." Jerry's mouth was grim. "I can get along with them, but you mought not," Worth said.